Welcome back. So, I introduced the Ottoman Empire briefly a few lectures back, and I promised we'd get back to it. We followed contemporary empire, the Spanish Empire of Charles V, and into their interactions in the Americas, but always at the same time, they're always competing with the Ottoman Empire, frequently at war with the Ottoman Empire. Uh, so now we're going to shift back to uh, a few centuries to the beginnings of the Ottoman Empire and trace their emergence, their eventual takeover of, as you can see, the area here is pretty much uh, territory that the Byzantine Empire occupied. The Ottoman Empire arose in Turkey, what's now Turkey, um, towards the tail end of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was on its decline. Uh, there were a number of Turkic tribes around. So that peninsula that we now call Turkey is also known as Anatolia. So yeah, Turkic tribes had been around there for centuries. Uh, Different empires had ruled that territory. Rome, it had been part of Rome. Byzantines. There's a period where the Crusaders from Europe, right, had come to try to conquer the Holy Land, and they had taken over that area as well, and the Mongols as well. So we've discussed, right, or we've talked about many empires that have governed this territory at one time or another, and these Turkic tribes sort of existed throughout all of this, right? Just sort of surviving and often thriving regardless of what empire was in control of their homeland. One of these leaders, Osman, uh, started to have some success against the Byzantine armies and began to gain sort of a notable amount of territory. Um, One of those areas that he conquered was the city of Bursa, right? And that was, well, actually his son conquered it. And that became the first Ottoman capital, right? So we started to have, something bigger than a tribe and starting to become a large state. Um, so Orhan married into Byzantine royalty. We'll see through the course of this lecture that strategic marriage is also a common um, in the Ottoman Empire, just as it was in the among Habsburgs and Charles V's empire. So that marriage gained Orhan some territory that included Gallipoli. So this is a strategic sort of coastal area that's right at the intersection of the Mediterranean and then the Sea of Marmara, which is uh, towards heading towards the Black Sea, right, and towards Asia. Right? So obviously it's an important trade route, right, and it's a nice military strategic location as well. So Oran continued to expand his territory largely, as you could see on that initial map on the first slide, right around coastal areas around the Mediterranean and the adjoining sea. So by 1362, uh, he had a kingdom that spread from Asia, right, to Europe. Uh, the sort of the culture and the general attitude of the empire was eclectic and rather tolerant from the very beginning. So it was a Islamic empire, uh, but it existed at this, intersection of Europe and Asia. They borrowed from Greek and Latin for their sort of civics and for the way they ran their cities. Um, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish religions all coexisted there. They used the feudal system that you may recall was introduced by the Byzantines, right, where you had um, inheritable land grants and the beginnings of nobles and lords and medieval system that we see uh, throughout Europe as well, and often adopted the military strategies of the Arab empires. So it is sort of a melting pot and a very sort of cosmopolitan, sort of a diverse sort of empire. So Osman's great grandson Bayezid expands the empire even further, uh, defeating Byzantines, defeating Crusaders. Right, there were still constantly Europeans sort of coming into the area in the Middle East, um, and other European powers, uh, but ultimately ran up against Tamerlane, which was sort of the latest of a long line of Mongol emperors. So Tamerlane was well, this is like the late 1300s, right? Um, so he ultimately defeated Bayezid and imprisoned him. So here the Tamerlane. Uh, so that there were setbacks, right? But the Ottoman Empire did persist. Um, they regrouped and always learned from their mistakes. So um, part of the way that they managed to persist was to use strategies other than military conquest. So if you're outmanned or outmaneuvered, um, strategic marriage is always another useful way to expand territory. Uh, and the Ottomans also used various strategies that we'll see later at keeping the empire together, despite you know internal revolts, crises of succession, and so on. So the empire lasted until 1922, right? So there are a photograph of from the Ottoman Empire, right? So we're getting into modern times here by the end of the Ottoman Empire. So the biggest prize, right, for the Ottomans was Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire was the biggest, you know, baddest sort of empire around. They were the Ottoman Empire grew sort of at the expense of the Byzantines, largely taking over their territory. So, to become the number one empire, you needed to take Constantinople, and ultimately, it came to that point, and they did siege and take over Constantinople. So, um, it was a impressive undertaking. If you may recall, Constantinople is placed and difficult to conquer. Um, many had tried for 1,000 years. So it's the Ottomans that finally do it, using again, they're sort of an eclectic Greek sailors, Serbian soldiers, Hungarian cannon builder. Again, now this is our first introduction, I think, to cannons, although the Spanish certainly had them. Um, but yeah, the cannons were invented in China in 12th, 13th centuries, and of course, they would have been in contact with the Ottoman Empire, and so cannons had made their way over to Europe into the Ottoman Empire. So they used cannons to attack Constantinople, um, and other sorts of skills that military skills learned from sort of Italians. And so again, they're picking and taking whatever they can, whatever they find useful. So they establish a naval blockade first of Constantinople and begin their siege in 1453. So in order to do that naval blockade, the Byzantines had a chain that they would run against across the waterway to stop ships from coming in if they needed to defend the city. So when the Ottomans encountered the chain, they simply loaded their boats on carts and took them on land and went around it. So ultimately, it was a huge operation and ultimately successful one. And so in 1453, the last remnant of the Roman Empire finally comes to an end, and we have the Ottoman Empire for another good 500-600 years. Being, a Mediterranean empire, trade, of course, was important. They now sort of dominated all the important trade routes in the Mediterranean and in Central Asia. It's a little small, but you can kind of see them here in red. So they stood at the center of this trade network that reached as far as Italy, from over to India, into China. Um, and so the wealth of the empire, right, and thus its durability as well, relied on keeping this trade flowing, right? Keeping the taxes flowing. Uh, so they needed a military force. They needed, right, to protect and defend these trade routes, but they also needed strong legal system, right, to ensure uh, the people felt that they could trade without being robbed or ripped off, but it also had to be somewhat flexible as well to be able to deal with diversity of different peoples that were involved in this trading network. One important development was systems of credit. You had to be able to um, borrow money, right, to finance an expedition, right, and then have some promise that the goods would be paid for on the other end. Maybe you needed some money up front and so on. So to finance these sorts of trading expeditions, you needed credit, and for credit, you need trust. And so often these systems developed at first within sort of very close kin groups, right? So among Jewish people, there was Jewish traders, there'd be a certain amount of trust, right? Knew each other, and it was bad business to rip anybody off, then um, you develop credit in that way. Similarly, among the Armenians or among the Greeks. Um, so insofar as those systems were working, the Ottomans didn't interfere with it, didn't try to do any serious uh, top-down reorganization of those trade systems, and simply provided a sort of stable political situation for those to thrive. So basically, as long as the taxes were paid, the Ottoman Empire allowed groups to go about their business they always had, didn't really interfere with their religion, and largely let them govern themselves. And we've seen this sort of, well, we've seen various approaches to empire. Right? So the Chinese were much more top down and less tolerant of diversity, right? And really did try to centralize and organize trade. The Romans and the Ottomans and the Byzantines were relatively laid back, right? It seems to be thinking about these Mediterranean empires that maybe it's a necessity, right? You're dealing with so much diversity. And then the in stark contrast, right, is the most recent empire we talked about, Spain, which was a Catholic empire and was very much devoted to making sure that everyone within the realm was Catholic. So the Ottomans, right, again, very different from the Spanish approach. Of course, as we've seen, embracing this diversity and the laid back approach brings its own dangers, right? So the more you let far flung areas kind of govern themselves or run their own thing, uh, more likely it is at some point they're going to wonder why they're even paying taxes and try to break off from the empire and go it alone. So the Ottomans frequently had to put down rebellions here and there across the empire. Um, they also had competitors in trade, right? You had the Habsburgs in Central Europe, the Venetians in Italy, also empires dependent on trade. Um, very much would like to control some of the territories the Ottomans controlled, and there were often battles over the control of certain port cities. Um, so the one group that the Ottomans were not very tolerant of religiously were Shiite Muslims, because they were part of the Safavid Empire, this Persian Empire in Iran, and so there were often sort of frequent battles there. So something about that fierceness of in, internecine, is that how you pronounce it? Uh, right, brother against brother sort of struggles can be more vicious, right? And so they weren't super tolerant of compared to so you may recall, right, that the Mongols were very much influenced by Turkic tribes, and in fact, the Mongol method for determining succession and the term Khan, right, that the Mongols used for their emperor, uh, was derived from Turkish traditions and Turkish tribes. If you remember, that method involved it wasn't just that you automatically chose the eldest son or something like that, but there was a bit of competition among potential heirs, right? Sometimes, political maneuvering, sometimes violence, right? But there was sort of a period where all the potential heirs would sort of um, battle it out, and then at the end there was a council that would choose the Khan, and sort of that period of political maneuvering would sort of reveal to everyone who was the most likely the most successful Khan. Uh, the way the Mongols did it, though, ended up splintering Genghis Khan's empire into four parts, if you might recall. Um, the Ottomans didn't do that. They kept the empire unified uh, by not doing the splintering, making succession an all or nothing sort of thing. But this ended up making the competition in the succession even all the more fierce, right? Because it was an all or nothing sort of thing. So you often had fratricide going on, brothers killing brothers. So murder became a advancement in the imperial family in the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottomans did borrow some things from the Islamic caliphates. One of those was the practice of having many wives, had up to four wives, I believe, in the Ottomans. But then also they had many concubines that were not official wives, but would bear children, and those children of a wife or a concubine uh, was considered legitimate and could be potentially an heir to the throne. Um, so once a wife or concubine gave birth to a child, she was no longer allowed to sleep with the king, right? And what would happen was the child was given a governorship somewhere in the empire. The mother would go off with the child to that part of the empire. If the child wasn't old enough, the mother would do the governing. Um, and at some point, that child might become heir to the throne. So, being a concubine, you were technically a slave, but you also had the potential for a fair amount of political power through your son. You had a son of the Sultan, um, and you were sort of in charge, right? The amount of control you had over the son was the amount of control you had over whatever territory that uh, was technically ruled. So, and while living in the palace, they lived in a harem uh, together, and this is right in the palace among all the powerful people. Uh, Again, these all of the concubines are sort of maneuvering for having a son that becomes an heir to the king. So it's sort of like a finishing school for women with political ambitions in a way, right? So they maneuvered for the political futures of their sons, which in turn gave them a good deal of power. So they weren't just sex slaves; they were a kind of political class. So, as you may have noticed at this point, right, marriage, um, marrying the right person was an important method of gaining and maintaining power in the Ottoman Empire. And so, having lots of wives, lots of concubines, lots of daughters created lots of opportunities for political alliance. So you could, um, right, you could take a wife from one neighboring empire and create an alliance there, and then keep marrying more wives from other empires, creating more alliances, right? So there was no uh, limit on the number of people number of women that a sultan could be associated with, and thus create alliances. And if you had lots of kids and lots of daughters that you could also marry to powerful people, facilitate further alliances. So a very complex web of marriages and in-laws that created helped you gain political and maintain political power. So men could marry into the sultan's family as well. So you could sort of marry up if you married a sultan's daughter. Of course, your children wouldn't be potential heirs to the throne, but you could come up in life by marriage as well. Uh, Suleiman, Suleiman famously sort of broke the norm here by falling in love, right? And so he fell for this Ukrainian Christian uh, harem, and so it was kind of scandalous in that culture where the norm was to have many wives and many concubines to um, forsake all of your other wives, concubines, and just have a monogamous relationship with one person that you were in love with. So it's interesting how norms change, right? And the notion of um, the, yeah, the Hollywood fairy tale romance was not always the gold standard of uh, of what it was of male female relationships, right? So to be in love with one person was actually quite strange. So the concubines in the harem were legally slaves, though we've seen that they could often become quite powerful, nonetheless. And this was common throughout the Ottoman Empire. So many high-ranking officials, including military leaders, were slaves of the Sultan. Uh, so the Muslim rulers of the Ottoman Empire were prohibited by religious law from taking certain people as slaves. So they couldn't take other Muslims as slaves. Certain Christians also were not allowed to be taken as slaves. So often slaves had to come in from outside of the empire, from Eastern Europe, like Slavic people, right? Slaves, Slavic, there's a logical link. Um, so, yeah, slaves could be anything from household servants. Um, they were the bulk of the military. They could be military commanders. Um, Another way of acquiring slaves was in military raids of outside territories, right? So that um, But as the empire sort of expanded and reached kind of its furthest limit, it was harder and harder to bring in slaves that way. And so they developed a new method of acquiring slaves. And this is the practice, excuse me, sorry. So the practice of devshirme became a way of acquiring slaves. Um, how this worked was boys were collected from primarily Christian families, taken from their families and into the palace, and taken as servants to the Sultan. Most of them became uh, soldiers, right, janissaries. Um, a more select group would go to the palace, uh, be educated, and become officials in the Sultan's administration. So it was slavery. It was literally sort of kidnapping people's children, but for some very poor families, having a son taken was potentially a form of upward mobility, right? So they could um, go to the palace, they might become educated, they might become important people, and so that could be a benefit to the family. So you know, different different times, different cultures, and again, we've seen this, I guess, throughout. And I'm curious to see your essay drafts to see if anyone's talking about slavery because uh, uh, particularly in the Ottoman Empire, it's an interesting and very different sort of approach to it, I think, than we're used to, where um, seems like a large proportion of the most powerful people in the empire are slaves, right? So uh, there's no hard and fast. Uh, Being a slave is not necessarily a detriment to everyone in this case in this empire, it seems. Right. So there's more to say about the Ottoman Empire, but I'm not going to make a long uh, lecture here. I think 20 to 30 minutes is about what people can absorb in any one sitting. So I'll continue the Ottoman Empire in the next lecture.